The year is 1947. Riding on the coattails of World War II, the world eased into an era of tension. An era of sustained tension. An era of sustained political and military tension between the powers of the Western world, led by the United States and its NATO allies, and the communist world, led by the Soviet Union, its satellite states, and allies. Now, this time period, beginning of 1947, was known as the Cold War. It is known as the Cold War because it never featured direct military actions, since both sides possessed such weapons as nuclear weaponry. Moreover, it was named the Cold War because of its distinct differentiation between wars of the past. The Cold War was the first of a new era of warfare. Fast forward 15 years to 1962.
A nuclear arms race brought the world to the brink of annihilation. The for so long isolated island nation of Cuba has now become the center of scrutiny for the world's eyes. Fidel Castro claims that the Russian missiles are solely for defense, but to the rest of the world observing with their apprehensive eyes, they are a deadly threat. The balance of the world teetered on the brink of destruction. Never before had the world experienced a threat of this caliber. These 15 days in October of 1962 mark a crisis forever solidified in the eyes of the international realm. These 15 days are the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis marks the first documented instance of the threat of mutual assured destruction being discussed as a determining factor in a major international arms agreement.
Mutually assured destruction is essentially a concept when two entities both possess large-scale weapons, like nuclear weapons, that neither party would use nuclear weapons for the fear of retaliation.
The ensuing crisis ranks with the Berlin blockade, the Suez Crisis, and the Yom Kippur War as one of the major confrontations of the Cold War, and is generally regarded as the moment in which the Cold War came closest to turning into a nuclear conflict.
Based on chatter recorded by the United States, suspicion arose that Soviet nuclear weapons might be based in Cuba, with missiles aimed towards the United States. President Kennedy authorized the U-2 reconnaissance plane, captained by Major Richard Heiser, a photographic reconnaissance specialist, who used a Ka Strip 18 camera to take thousands of pictures in a matter of minutes from 12 miles overhead. Heiser's results were miles of films that were then examined for days by teams of experts. Upon conclusion, certain irregularities were found in regions surrounding the city of St. Cristobal. These suspicions were confirmed by a Department of Defense missile team, who agreed that the irregularities were consistent with the beginnings of base launch site construction. These pictures would change the world. Nuclear missiles were on the doorstep of the United States. On October 16th, the race against time began. After closer inspection, it was ascertained that the Soviet missiles placed in Cuba could reach the Capitol building in under 10 minutes.
One of the main reasons the Soviet Union placed these missiles on Cuba was this idea of a missile gap. Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union at that time, had total control of the Soviet Union, and he was determined that his country would flourish again and that communism would ultimately triumph over capitalism. But in reality, the whole crisis was due to the fact that the United States of America did not want to recognize the Soviet Union as an equal player, which constitutes this idea, as mentioned before, of a missile gap. Recently, in that time period, the United States placed 45 Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey, well within striking distance of Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. The American plus the English plus the French forces equaled over 5,000 nuclear weapons, whereas the Soviet Union only had about 300 nuclear weapons. The Soviet response to this missile gap was the SS-4 intermediate range missile. It is a part of the plan to reach parity with the American missile capacity. 36 of these intermediate-range missiles would make Cuba an impregnable fortress. 36 of these missiles, with nuclear warheads, is as powerful as 66 of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everyone in the Oval Office agreed. Something had to be done. The threat was too imminent.
Kennedy, in secret, put together what was known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM for short. Essentially, this group consisted of various members of his cabinet and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The committee was varied in opinion, with the military personnel advocating for a militaristic approach and the other personnel advocating for a political diplomatic approach.
Kennedy and his ex-com staff discussed 5 different possibilities of action. Firstly, they wanted to explore diplomatic pressure to get the Soviet Union to remove the missiles. If that didn't work, they planned on sending a warning, a message to Castro to warn him of the danger that he and his country were in. Then, they discussed a blockade, using the Navy to block any more missiles from arriving in Cuba or departing. An airstrike was also considered, using the Air Force to bomb all known missile sites that they had found using the U-2 spy planes. And their last and final idea was a full-force invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro.
After 7 days of guarded and intense debate within the echelons of the government and within EXCOM, Kennedy concluded to impose a naval quarantine around Cuba. He wished to prevent the arrival of more Soviet offensive weapons on the island. And then on October 22nd, Kennedy announced the discovery of the missile installations to the public and his decision to quarantine the island. He also proclaimed that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union and demanded that the Soviets remove all of their offensive weapons from Cuba.
During the public phase of the crisis, tensions began to build on both sides. Kennedy eventually ordered low-level reconnaissance missions once every 2 hours. On the 25th, Kennedy pulled the quarantine line back and raised military readiness to DEFCON 2. Then, on the 26th, EXCOM heard from Khrushchev in an impassioned letter. He proposed removing Soviet missiles and personnel if the U.S. would guarantee not to invade Cuba. On October 27th, the worst day of the crisis occurred. A U-2 was shot down over Cuba, and an EXCOM received a second letter from Khrushchev demanding the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles in Cuba. Attorney General Robert Kennedy suggested ignoring the second letter and contacted Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to tell him of the U.S. agreement with the first.
On October 27th, after much deliberation between the Soviet Union and Kennedy's cabinet, Kennedy secretly agreed to remove all missiles set in southern Italy and in Turkey, the latter on the border of the Soviet Union, in exchange for Khrushchev removing all missiles in presence in Cuba. Then, on October 28th, Khrushchev publicly announced that he would dismantle the installations and return the missiles to the Soviet Union, expressing his trust the United States would not invade Cuba.
The compromise was a particularly sharp embarrassment for Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, because the withdrawal of the U.S. missiles from Italy and Turkey was not made public at the time. It was a secret deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Soviets were seen as retreating from circumstances that they had started, though if played well, it could have looked just the opposite. Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later can be partially linked to Khrushchev's eventual concessions to the U.S. and his ineptitude in precipitating the crisis in the first place. Cuba perceived it as a partial betrayal by the Soviets, given that decisions on how to resolve the crisis had been made exclusively between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Castro was especially upset that certain issues of interest to Cuba, such as the status of Guantanamo, were not addressed. This caused the Cuban-Soviet relations to deteriorate for years to come. The Cuban Missile Crisis spurred the Hotline Agreement, which created the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communications link between Moscow and Washington, D.C. The purpose was to have a way that the leaders of the two Cold War countries could communicate directly to solve such a crisis.
Thus, it can be seen, although the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis was greatly consequential for the countries of the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the United States, there was some benefit. There was the benefit that the United States gained the knowledge on how to deal with such large-scale threats and such large-scale warfare. And as a result, the Cuban Missile Crisis will always be remembered in the United States as well as the world's history for being one of the first and most influential large-scale standoffs in the international realm.